Worst Jobs of the War, Vietnam Edition. The Vietnam War lasted for decades, with the North Vietnamese engaging South Vietnam, the United States, and other allies in a protracted guerrilla war. The fighting raged across jungles, in the air, and even underground, as both sides vied for supremacy. During this drawn-out conflict, some of those who fought there found themselves in situations that were more deadly, more terrifying, or just plain more unpleasant than soldiers that were fighting elsewhere. The tunnel rat and tunnel warfare. The lightly armed forces of the Vietcong were unable to match the firepower that the Americans had at their disposal, and so adopted a guerrilla style of warfare, striking at vulnerable targets before melting back into the jungle again without a trace. It was soon discovered that the VC and NVA had made extensive use of underground tunnels, some of which were so substantial that they covered entire districts. Large forces could be moved to and fro underground completely undetected. These subterranean complexes featured living quarters, medical facilities, supply depots, kitchens, and other spaces to make life underground more bearable, though conditions were still pretty miserable. The air was stagnant, food would rot quickly in the moist conditions, and there were constant plagues of mice, spiders, snakes, and other pests that made the tunnels their home. Bodies would often be recovered from the battlefield and hidden underground to deny the Americans an accurate body count, and leaving a putrid stench in the air as the corpses rotted in the moist soil. The tunnels were shrouded in darkness, illumination provided by candles or occasionally electric lighting powered by bicycle dynamos. When American forces first discovered the tunnel complexes, they were just too numerous to simply collapse, as there could be multiple entrances miles apart, and anyway, the intel found within them was too valuable to simply just destroy. This is when a specialist unit was formed and trained to deal with this new threat, referred to as tunnel rats. Armed with a .45 pistol, a flashlight, and incredible courage, these men engaged the enemy in the confines under the earth. Usually men of smaller stature, the tunnel rats would crawl through the dark and claustrophobic spaces on one-man seek-and-destroy missions. The dangers were numerous and ever-present. Punji stakes and tripwires attached to grenades or other explosive devices littered the spaces at random intervals. The VC would wait patiently around a tight corner with a knife or bayonet or even a garrote, ready to strike or strangle an unwary rat groping through the darkness. Missions could last for hours, which primarily involved gathering intelligence and sabotaging any supplies found before returning to the surface. Combat in these confined spaces was brutal, the fighters often foregoing firearms in favor of knives and bayonets in the dim conditions. After their missions were completed, the tunnel rats would leave the tunnels with captured documents, weapons, and sometimes even prisoners. The men would often whistle Dixie before emerging, making their presence as an American known, as a small mud-caked figure exiting the subterranean gloom could easily be mistaken for an enemy. Vietcong Infiltrators. By 1968, it became clear to the Viet Cong that there could be no victory against the overwhelming might of the United States in a direct military conflict. Their aim was to take advantage of the growing unpopularity of the war, which was brewing up in the United States, and scoring a political victory instead. To achieve this, the VC came up with a bold plan, one that would shake the confidence of the American and South Vietnamese war effort. Called the Tet Offensive, as it coincided with the celebration of the holiday of Tet, or Lunar New Year, a time when hostilities traditionally slackened. Intelligence had reported a buildup of VC and NVA forces for months, but no one knew the size or scale of the operation. Then, on January 30th, 1968, they were unleashed. 84,000 communist fighters descended on hundreds of targets around South Vietnam, from the ancient city of Hue to outposts like Khe Sanh. The bulk of the attention, however, was directed at the capital city of Saigon, and most importantly, the American embassy itself. Early in the morning on January 31st, 19 VC sappers of the C-10 battalion launched an attack on the embassy. Though caught off guard, the military police stationed there engaged in a firefight with the infiltrators and managed to close the main gate. Undeterred, the VC blasted a hole in the outer wall of the compound with a satchel charge and stormed in, but their leaders were soon killed and their attack lost momentum. 2 RPGs were fired, wounding a Marine and blasting the seal of the United States off the wall, but otherwise caused no damage. The infiltrators exchanged gunfire with the embassy guards until U.S. reinforcements arrived, and the remaining attackers were then either killed or captured, though it took almost 6 hours after the initial attack for the embassy grounds to be declared secure. In pure military terms, the assault on the embassy, much like the rest of the Tet Offensive, was a disaster. The attacks were repulsed and the Vietcong suffered titanic casualties, from which they would never fully recover. But that wasn't the point. The grounds of the embassy had barely been declared secure when an army of press reporters swarmed over the grounds, taking video and photographic evidence of what had transpired there. Images were sent back to America of dead enemy soldiers laying within yards of the main building, of bloodied American officials wounded in the attack, the smoke and debris-strewn courtyard that was once a symbol of American presence in the region, so blatantly violated. The burgeoning anti-war movement gained strength, and the war was seen as unwinnable. The infiltrators who attacked the embassy and other targets knew they were being sent on a suicide mission, but did so anyway, knowing that their sacrifice would ultimately lead to victory for their side. The Agent Orange Sprayer. The dense jungles of Southeast Asia provided the perfect terrain for lightly armed NVA and Vietcong forces to conduct their guerrilla war against the ponderous American military. Frustrated at the enemy's ability to melt into the jungle and disappear without a trace, American military planners made the decision to utilize the chemical defoliant, Agent Orange, which became one of the most controversial acts of the war. Other methods of clearing the forests of Vietnam were tried, including using napalm to create fires. The wet conditions prevented self-sustaining fires from spreading, and bulldozing or bombing sections of the jungle. But these were time-consuming and expensive. Some other chemical defoliants were tried, such as Agents White and Purple, but none were more extensively used as Agent Orange. This could be sprayed manually on the ground, but most often was deployed by aircraft, usually C-123 Provider cargo planes outfitted with special booms to dispense the chemical. In order to ensure that the defoliant was concentrated enough, the large planes had to fly low to the ground, which made them vulnerable to ground fire. Often, the aircraft would fly with an escort of F-4 Phantoms who would engage the enemy while the liquid was dispensed. Use of the defoliant became contentious right from the beginning. The Geneva Convention forbids the use of chemical weapons in warfare, but the U.S. government disagreed, as the Agent Orange would be used against vegetation, not humans, and the chemical had already been used domestically to control plant growth. Over the course of the war, over 19 million gallons of Agent Orange were spread over 6 million acres of land in Southeast Asia, causing devastating environmental damage and killing off all plant life that was exposed to it. Most concerning, however, was the toll on human health, as Agent Orange contains dioxin, a byproduct of the manufacturing process, and even during the war, lab tests among mice showed an increase in birth defects, miscarriages, and stillborns. Dioxin is also a known carcinogenic, and the levels of dioxin found in the herbicides used in Vietnam contain twice the amount used domestically. Agent Orange can also contaminate the ground it was sprayed on for years afterwards, leaching into the soil and accumulating in the bodies of people living in the region, passing on its effects to future generations. It is claimed that up to 2 million Vietnamese suffer from the after effects of Agent Orange, though this is disputed. In the years after the war, there have been numerous studies about the short and long-term effects of Agent Orange exposure, which have been subject to controversy. It's unclear if the medical conditions of those exposed to Agent Orange are caused by the herbicide or lifestyle and other factors. Still, without admitting liability, several companies that manufactured Agent Orange paid out a $180 million settlement in 1984 to veterans claiming medical issues due to the defoliant. Number 4. The Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol. Intelligence gathering is one of the most important yet often overlooked aspects of any conflict. Throughout the Vietnam War, American planners and strategists need a constant supply of information on the VC's and NVA's activities in order to counter their threat. One of the ways this was done was through the use of long-range reconnaissance patrols, or LRRPs. Known as LRRPs, these patrols consisted of small teams whose mission was to infiltrate deep into enemy territory. Their primary mission was intelligence gathering, making note of the location and movement of the enemy, which was usually along well-established trails. They would also engage in prisoner snatch operations for interrogation, as well as ambushing small detachments of enemy forces. After a successful engagement, they would gather weapons and any documents found before making their way to the extraction site. The missions carried out by the LRP were both difficult and dangerous. Due to the nature of their task, the number of men was limited, usually around 6, and had limited firepower, relying on stealth and ingenuity to carry out their assignments. As deep as they were inside enemy territory, even the slightest noise could alert the enemy of their position, so they would forego the cumbersome protective gear like flak jackets and steel helmets issued to other troops, replacing them with soft flop hats and fatigues. Disturbed foliage, leaving footprints and other markings could lead to discovery. If found, 6 lightly armed men would have to hold off much greater numbers of enemy soldiers until help could arrive. The LRPs would often operate outside of the envelope of friendly artillery fire bases, meaning the only support would be from hastily scrambled aircraft, which could be several minutes away, a lifetime on the battlefield. They were almost always greatly outnumbered. If a medevac was needed, it was almost always under enemy fire, which would have to be suppressed before the chopper could land and evacuate the wounded. It took a special kind of man to participate in this type of work. Self-reliant types who thrived on danger and were willing to operate in small, self-sufficient groups far away from security and safety. The war in Vietnam was a conflict known for its brutal nature. Whether fought in the jungle, in the air, or underground, there were some jobs that were more dangerous or just more miserable for those that had to endure them. In spite of the circumstances, these tasks were carried out with bravery, determination, and grit.
The most dangerous jobs in the military. Warfare is one of the most hazardous experiences that humans can be faced with. Virtually all jobs within a combat zone carry some degree of risk, but there are some tasks that are more dangerous or just plain more stressful than others. These are just a few of those professions. The forward observer. One of the most devastating tools used in the military today are indirect fire artillery barrages, capable of hurling powerful munitions for miles. Batteries of artillery and mortars can devastate the enemy positions while remaining safely out of range and out of sight of any return fire. Due to the long range of these modern artillery pieces, and the fact that they can remain concealed behind hills, buildings, and other obstacles, the gun crews rarely see their targets, nor the effect that their shells have when they land. The forward observer acts as the eyes and ears of the guns, relaying information to the battery. When a target is identified, the observer will call in the coordinates to the artillery crews, who would then adjust their sights. As the shells start falling, the observer then marks the effect on the target, marking corrections so the munitions hit most effectively. In order to clearly observe the enemy positions, the forward observer is almost always within visual range of them. Though they can operate independently, they are often attached to infantry units, helping to support the troops as they advance. They share the same risks as their comrades, but carry an additional target on their backs. As they control a massive amount of firepower, the enemy makes them a priority target once they have been identified. Blending in is difficult, since they are equipped with radios and other communication gear, and in the midst of a firefight, will be calling in enemy positions rather than fighting directly, marking them for special attention. There is also the risk that they may make a miscalculation in the heat of battle. Should the observer send the wrong information, there's a risk that the artillery could miss the enemy, failing to support the engaged infantry, or worse still, land among friendly forces. This is exacerbated when danger close fire missions are called, desperate situations that require artillery or mortars to land generally within 600 meters of friendly troops, something only to be used in the most dire of circumstances. Nowadays, this task is ever increasingly being taken up by airborne drones and other unmanned observation tools, but forward observers have some of the lowest life expectancies among soldiers on the battlefield. The combat medic. When a soldier is injured on the battlefield, receiving prompt medical treatment is paramount to ensure their survival. To ensure that a wounded soldier is given treatment as soon as possible, combat medics are on hand to begin treatment even as the bullets are still flying, stabilizing their patients for evacuation to more extensive medical facilities. These brave individuals share the same risks as their comrades, such as gunshot wounds, IED detonations, and a myriad of other hazards in a combat zone. In addition to these dangers, there are many others that are unique to the medic. When a soldier is wounded by enemy fire, the medic will begin treatment as soon as possible, knowing that a second's delay can spell disaster. Often, this includes acting under fire, exposing the medic to the enemy while performing their duties. While the Geneva Convention forbids the targeting of medical personnel, this rule is not always followed, even by soldiers of signatory nations. Terrorist groups and other insurgent forces are not signatories of the convention and are therefore not bound to its regulations. These irregular forces will deliberately target the medic, knowing that the death of such a valued member of a unit can cripple morale. In order to protect themselves, medics are allowed to carry personal weapons, which they can use to defend themselves or their patients while still remaining under the protection of the Geneva Convention, though they lose this status if they use their weapons offensively. If wounded themselves, the medics will not always receive the best of medical care. Most patrols only have one designated medic, and while all soldiers have rudimentary training in battlefield medicine, it is not the specialized training necessary to stabilize the patient until they can be moved to more advanced facilities. They will find themselves under the care of comrades who may have their best interests in mind, but lack the skills to be the most effective. Another danger medics face is infection. While treating the wounded in a combat zone, it is not always possible to don protective gear, such as sterile latex gloves. While treating an injured soldier, they run the risk of contracting a bloodborne disease, compounding the dangers of this difficult profession. The War Correspondent. Nowadays, the average person has access to breaking news from around the world in the palm of their hands. In order to relay this vital information to the general public, war correspondents place themselves in some of the worst conditions on the planet. Journalists in war zones share many of the same dangers that soldiers engaged in the fighting experience, but do so without the same level of training, protection, or equipment. When under fire, they may not know how to react properly, putting themselves at greater risk than the soldiers. Correspondents are unarmed, as they are classified as civilians under the Geneva Convention and international law. Some less than scrupulous sides in a conflict take advantage of this fact, sending journalists into harm's way, using their potential death or wounding as propaganda to demonize the other side. Many media outlets are underfunded and cannot afford to pay for professional correspondents. Because of this, many rely on freelancers, unaffiliated journalists who have less support than the professionals, and take risks that their more experienced counterparts would never even contemplate. This is compounded by the public's fascination with the risks of a war zone. Stories of reporters dodging gunfire or surviving artillery barrages sell much better than dull reports of casualty figures or troop movements. This encourages recklessness, increasing the chances of the journalist becoming a casualty. In this modern age, deaths, wounds, PTSD, alcoholism, and drug abuse are common among journalists who travel around the world, putting themselves in harm's way, armed only with a camera and a notepad. No matter what the profession, those in combat face risks that the average person can only dream of. For a few, their chosen occupation places them in even greater danger, but they still answer the call with bravery and distinction.
EOD suit. Bomb disposal. Being an explosive ordnance disposal technician is one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. For EOD technicians, there is no way to evade the danger. Their job is to locate, identify, and neutralize an explosive device, whether it's an ordnance or an improvised one. It's a high-stake job where the slightest mistake could cost them their life. The beginnings of the EOD units go back to World War II. During the Blitz on London, many of the German bombs dropped on the city didn't explode. Some were even fused to detonate hours after they were dropped, designed to create the impression of a longer bombardment. In order to eliminate the threat of such bombs, special unexploded ordnance teams were established. These engineers by profession were tasked with finding unexploded bombs and then disarming them or detonating them safely. Soon the British were joined by volunteers from the US Navy, who then passed the trade to their own units. This was the birth of the so-called bomb squad units that today exist in almost every army in the world. Since the Blitz, the explosive ordnance disposal unit's job has changed a lot. Over time, as the danger has spread from the battlefield to the streets of big cities, EOD units entered police forces as well. In recent history, there have been many challenges for EOD technicians. The problems they faced come from many different types of explosive devices, from the old unexploded bombs to sophisticated biochemical bombs. The field where they operate can be in a subway of a world metropolis to the deserts of the Middle East. The rise of the 21st century gained momentum in the development of EOD units. The war on terror pushed bomb technicians for the first time into the first lines of combat, participating in combat and covert missions. In Afghanistan and Iraq, these improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, were the equivalent of what booby traps were to U.S. troops in the Vietnam War. Apart from engaging enemies directly, soldiers of the U.S.-led coalition forces were also fighting against these invisible enemies. Far worse than landmines that soldiers were accustomed to, IEDs were impossible for ordinary infantrymen to deal with because it's an explosive that can be detonated by someone far away at the moment of their choice. The majority of these devices were made with such great skill and craftiness that only a specialist could handle them. This was the brave job for the EOD technicians. The first step for the EOD technician was to locate the device. In Afghanistan and Iraq, U.S. Army and Navy EOD units would often use bomb-sniffing dogs for that purpose. However, finding the explosive device was the easiest part. Once an IED was found and the perimeter secured, the EOD technician would commence its neutralization. The job of neutralizing the bomb has been recently switching to specialized robots controlled by EOD technicians from a safe distance. However, most missions are still performed by human technicians because of the better control in their own hands than a robot's remote controls. Apart from that, areas may often be completely unreachable to robots. Defusing any kind of explosive device is a tricky business, but one that has to be done. At first glance, it would be much easier to detonate the bomb from a safe distance than to risk lives by neutralizing it. The reason why diffusions were performed was that there's no certainty how powerful the explosive device is, how it will react, and if there was some kind of chemical agent inside. Diffusing any kind of explosive device was a tricky business. Before making their move, the technician had to examine the device and determine how it worked. Very often, they had no luxury of taking their time. More importantly, the slightest mistake was paid at a hefty price. Unlike soldiers in combat, the EOD technician was standing inches away from the danger and had no cover to hide behind. The only thing that stood between him and the deadly contraption was his protection, the EOD suit. The EOD suit is a special protective suit designed for use by EOD specialists. Its purpose is to protect the wearer from injuries caused by an explosion. Most of this heavy and bulky suit's features are installed to protect from fragmentation caused by an eventual blast. However, modern suits are designed in such a manner that they provide protection from other injuries that could also be caused by explosive devices. The most common are blast injuries caused by an exploding blast wave, an intense overpressurization impulse created by a detonation. When it impacts the human body, this high pressure causes severe injuries on internal organs, which are usually lethal. Another type of injury could be caused by blast wind, a forced, overheated airflow. In the end, there is a threat that the explosive device is armed with chemical or biological agents. To protect from this specific kind of danger, some bomb suits are also equipped with self-containing breathing apparatus. A modern EOD suit is designed to protect from all these dangers. During World War II, bomb technicians had no special suits or any kind of protective gear whatsoever. There were simply no available materials that could provide protection from blasts such as from aerial bombs or unexploded artillery shells, or even from landmines. 2 decades later, the first types of suits appeared. They consisted of flak vests that were worn over chainmail shirts and were then combined with armor-plated head coverings. EOD technicians wearing these suits largely resembled medieval Templars. Only after materials such as Kevlar found their way into military use did the modern type of bomb suits appear. Using these materials, the first EOD suits that we know today were made in the 1990s. They provided better protection and covered the entire body. Its Kevlar was strong enough to stop the impact of bomb fragments but was unable to withhold the blast wave. This problem was later solved by adding foam layers that absorbed the blast. Further improvements were also made to protect the technician from chemical and biological agents. Modern EOD suits consist of several sections: the trousers, a jacket with a high collar, and a groin section. The entire suit is coated with a flame-retardant fabric that protects the technician from heat blasts and fire. The inside sections are fitted with protective inserts consisting of thick layers of ballistic material, foam, and fiber which provide fragmentation and overpressure protection. For additional protection, the chest, lower abdomen, and the spine are protected with armored steel plates with an absorbing layer of foam for the spine plate.
Each section provides various fragmentation protection levels with the ability to stop fragments from penetrating the suit with a velocity of 1,100 feet per second at the trousers and up to 3,200 feet per second on the collar. The chest and spine plates, meanwhile, have a special level of protection, capable of stopping fragments at 5,200 feet per second. The head, as the most important part of the body, is protected with a ballistic helmet with a visor made of scratch-resistant acrylic with polycarbonate backing. The inside of the helmet is equipped with an air ventilation and radio communication system. Additional protection for the head is provided by the high collar. Not only does it give fragmentation protection, it also secures the head from an abrupt change in position when hit by a blast. And finally, the feet are protected by protective overshoes. The only part of the body that isn't protected are the hands, which need to be dexterous. Bomb technicians don't wear gloves as they reduce the sensation in their fingers. When handling biochemical explosive devices, technicians also wear chemical protective undergarments. Even though EOD suits have evolved over time to provide the best possible protection and comfort for technicians in the field, they still do come with a set of drawbacks. The most obvious is the bulkiness of the entire suit, which can weigh up to 80 pounds. This is quite a heavy burden for a technician that needs to focus on neutralizing the explosive device. It also reduces his mobility to a large degree. There have been cases in Afghanistan and Iraq where technicians were caught in the crossfire and killed because they were unable to run away from the scene to look for cover. Another important drawback is that the structure of the suit and materials used do not allow heat dissipation. This results in high temperatures inside the suit, going up to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which then can lead to serious heat stress and heat illness. The latest EOD suit designs have made some progress in dealing with these issues. The EOD-10 suit, which is used by the United States Air Force in EOD operations, comes with a bodysuit that has an integrated cooling system that consists of a water pump that circulates cold water through small tubes wrapped around the entire suit. The suit also has improved mobility, as it has a more compact design and utilizes the latest lightweight ballistic materials that significantly reduce the overall weight. Despite being cumbersome and difficult to withstand, EOD suits were still the first choice of protection for EOD technicians in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2001. There were, however, opposing experiences with EOD suits, primarily because of the overheating issues. While on the mission, EOD specialists preferred not to use suits until they began working on neutralizing the IED. Some, not even then. They believed suit protection was insufficient against IEDs and preferred wearing only light protection that didn't cause heat stroke. Not using the suit may be why U.S. forces lost more than 50 EOD technicians on missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the other hand, EOD suits saved the lives of many technicians. Once hit by an explosion, these suits significantly increase their chances of surviving. U.S. Army Chemical Corps. The Seaburn Defense. The Chemical Corps is a special branch of the United States Army, which is responsible for preventing and combating any attack on the United States, which includes chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, including any weapons of mass destruction. On top of their primary role, the CBRN units specialize in training other military personnel in basic knowledge and awareness surrounding and dealing with any associated threats. The unit is commonly referred to as CBRN as an abbreviation. The origins of the Corps date back to World War I. It was the first conflict that saw extensive use of chemical weapons, and the use of poison gas became a common tactic used by both sides in trying to overcome the stalemate created by trench warfare. When the U.S. entered the war in late 1917, they found that they had to quickly react to the enemy's vast experience in chemical warfare. So on June 28, 1918, they formed the Chemical Warfare Service. In 1920, Congress made it a branch of the Army. The Dragon Soldiers, as they were called at the time, adopted their branch insignia, a purple benzene ring over two crossed gold retorts. The insignia still stands as the symbol of the Corps today. At the end of World War I, the Chemical Warfare Service continued working on the development of offensive and defensive capabilities for aspects of chemical warfare, despite mounting public disapproval of such weapons.
The United States was among the few countries that refused to ratify the 1925 Geneva Convention ruling, which aimed to limit the use of chemical weapons. Unlike World War I, the use of chemical weapons in World War II was on a far smaller scale. All major powers involved had developed and stockpiled large quantities of chemical and biological weapons, yet refrained from instigating their use due to the fear of retaliation from the opposing side. The constant threat of Germany and Japan using their chemical weapons forced the United States Army to significantly increase their investment into the Chemical Warfare Service. Several installations were built to produce and develop weapons and to train personnel for chemical warfare-related operations. More than 400 CWS companies were formed during the war, numbering more than 60,000 military personnel. They played a key role in equipping and training regular Army units to recognize the symptoms of chemical weapon use. Dragon soldiers also provided combat support with M2 4.2-inch mortars known as the 4 Deuce, or chemical mortars, which were capable of launching white phosphorus-based smoke shells, TNT high-explosive shells, and HD sulfur mustard gas shells over a distance of 4,400 yards, or 2.5 miles. After the war, the Chemical Warfare Service was reduced in size, but it still continued with its mission. In 1946, the service was officially redesignated the Chemical Corps. During the Vietnam War between 1955 and 1975, it developed a variety of weapons designed primarily to disrupt the enemy's concealment capabilities. They began to develop weapons such as napalm, an incendiary mixture which has a devastating effect on its target. However, the most notorious chemical weapon was Agent Orange, a herbicide used to destroy large areas of dense forest used to provide cover to the Vietcong fighters. Controversy surrounding the health problems caused by Agent Orange turned the public against the use of chemical weapons and against the Chemical Corps, which was again under threat of disbandment. The Corps fell into difficult times until the 1980s and the rise of chemical and biological warfare capabilities of certain Middle Eastern countries. This posed a threat to American interests in the region. By the beginning of the Gulf War in 1990 to 91, the Army had established 28 active-duty chemical defense companies, with each regular Army unit having at least one seaburn specialist in its ranks. By the beginning of the 21st century, the threat of attacks has only increased, with the capability of chemical and biological warfare passing from regular Army and government control to individual terrorist groups. This rising concern has led to an increase in the development levels of U.S. military installations and facilities against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear hazards. Candidates who wish to become members of the Chemical Corps must first pass through the United States Army Seaburn School. The school is located in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, home to the Chemical Corps. Over the course of the training, future seaburn specialists will be trained to detect and deal with situations caused by chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, that is, weapons of mass destruction. While some courses are intended for the development of individual skills, equally important are those which develop teamwork. Seaburn defense requires complex organizational skills and operations to go ahead with a minimal margin for error. To become an Army Seaburn Specialist, candidates join the MOS 74D, which stands for Military Occupational Specialty 74 Delta course. The regimental crest is blue and gold and is taken from the 1st Chemical Regiment's coat of arms and shows a dragon along with a war-torn tree trunk, which was all they could use for sighting and weapons during World War I. The Latin phrase at the bottom of the crest translates into "We rule the battle through the elements." Part of the Army basic training involves squads lined up wearing respirators and entering a gas chamber building, where they're subjected to CS gas being released. After familiarizing themselves with the impaired coordination effects of wearing the mask, they are then ordered to remove them and then exit the fume-filled room in an orderly manner. Once outside in the fresh air, there's a lot of coughing, choking, and spitting, as well as trying to wipe the tears away from their watering eyes. The experience will stay with them for the rest of their military careers, but they will be able to react and put on their respirators in seconds when they have to. After finishing the initial training, the Seaburn Specialists are taught various skills to enhance their responses, such as awareness, detection, decontamination, protection, first aid, and command and control. Another part of their course is where candidates are exposed to toxic agents while wearing their protective suits. The job of a seaburn specialist not only requires great theoretical knowledge, but also a lot of practical skills, especially the ability to work under pressure for prolonged periods. Once the training is over and the candidates join the ranks of the Dragon soldiers, they're deployed to various units throughout the Army. The duties for a seaburn specialist involve not only handling related threats, but also to provide training and supervision regarding the proper use of seaburn equipment among their fellow soldiers, whatever their rank might be. In the field, specialists use a variety of technical devices for detection and handling of threats. The most important aspect of their role, however, is their personal protective equipment, or PPE. Protection suits are designed primarily to protect against injuries that may occur when handling any hazardous material in any situation. Protection is not only paramount for the body, but also for the respiratory system, eyesight, and hearing. There are different PPE sets in use depending on requirements. In cases where the highest degree of protection is needed, a Level A set is used. It consists of a fully encapsulating chemical protective suit, a protective hood, an inner and outer set of chemical-resistant gloves, chemical-resistant boots, and a positive pressure self-contained breathing apparatus. The protective suit is made of a chemical-resistant material and provides protection to the seaburn agents against liquids, vapors, and aerosols. It's designed to be air-permeable, lightweight, and ergonomic in order to provide comfort to the specialist inside. The same material is used for the hood, to which a mask is attached, which may either be a breathing filter with active carbon or the self-contained breathing apparatus. The primary role of the PPE is to protect the specialists in the field, and even though it's designed to provide as much comfort as possible, it does have some limitations. While wearing the suit, movement is restricted due to the heavyweight nature of the PPE. The same applies for both vision and communication due to the face protection. Since the suit is fully encapsulating, specialists are exposed to psychological stress due to the confinement, heat stress, and dehydration. It's estimated that the Level A PPE cannot be worn continuously for more than 30 minutes. Considering the conditions involved when working directly with highly toxic and other lethal agents, and in operations where weapons of mass destruction are a real threat, the job of the seaburn specialist comes in as one of the most challenging occupations in the United States Army.
The Chernobyl Liquidators. Chernobyl Nuclear Disaster, 1986. April 26, 1986 was the date of the worst nuclear disaster in history. What was supposed to be a standard safety test ended up with the explosion of reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine in the Soviet Union. Due to a breach of the test protocols and design flaws of the reactor itself, an enormous amount of energy was released, causing a huge steam explosion followed by a fire. A large amount of radioactive dust was released into the air that precipitated in a wide circle around the plant. The response of the power plant crew and firemen was immediate, as there were fears the fire could damage nearby reactor number 3. It only took 5 hours for the brave firefighters to extinguish the fires outside of the reactor. Inside reactor 4, however, the blaze lasted a full 2 weeks before finally being extinguished. During this time, the fire was releasing radioactive dust and particles into the air. Citizens of the nearby town of Pripyat were evacuated on April 27th. 1 day later, the world found out about the terrifying incident. Once the fire was extinguished and the danger of further explosions eliminated, what remained was a complete mess. It was a mess that someone had to clean up. Around 600,000 people were recruited by the Soviet government for the job. They were known as the Liquidators. In perhaps the greatest cleanup operation ever, the Liquidators managed to limit both the immediate and long-term damage from the disaster. Recruitment of the Liquidators began immediately after the incident. Workers were brought in from across the country. Most of the Liquidators that were recruited were men and women between 30 and 40 years old, but there were people as young as 15, as well as 60-plus-year-old veterans. The reason why hundreds of thousands of people were engaged in the cleaning was so that no one person would be exposed to radiation for a prolonged period of time. Contrary to health and safety recommendations, many volunteered to work for longer periods than they were required. Most of the Liquidators were recruited from ranks of firemen and military personnel, but civilians were also brought in. There were three groups of liquidators based on the period in which they were engaged after the incident. In the initial phase, the liquidators were employees of the power plant and firemen from the plant fire station who were on site when the accident happened. These men participated in putting out the fires and preventing it from spreading to other reactors. They suffered the highest dose of radiation. Most of them were completely aware of the danger, but still performed their duty. In the early phase, liquidators were brought into the plant and the city of Pripyat after it was evacuated. This group included most of the people engaged in cleanup operations and building the sarcophagus above the reactor that had exploded. In the late phase, liquidators were engaged in the final stages of the cleanup after the sarcophagus was built. Aside from the liquidators performing cleaning operations, there were also support groups, such as internal troops and police, who carried out the evacuation of the population, provided security, and secured the area from unauthorized passage. Additionally, there were hundreds of medical personnel who provided care to the wounded soldiers of the plant and to the liquidators during the entire operation. There were even special hunting squads organized to exterminate pets and animals in the evacuated areas. Liquidators were engaged in a number of different duties, all with the task of cleaning up the area from contaminated objects and the radioactive dust. Every morning, thousands of liquidators would line up in their camps to receive orders for their daily tasks in an 18.5-mile or 30-kilometer radius around the destroyed reactor, called the exclusion zone. Because of the high level of radiation contamination, most of the smaller houses in the area were demolished and buried in specially made waste repositories. Thousands of affected trees in the so-called Red Forest were cut down and also buried. Once the designated areas were swept up, liquidators treated them with Borda, a special gel designed to suppress and trap the radioactive dust. Once the gel had dried, it could be peeled off and buried in repositories. The same substance was used to clean up the streets and buildings in the city of Pripyat. The most important job was building the concrete sarcophagus around reactor number 4 that would prevent weathering of the reactor and further emission of radioactive particles into the air. In order to build it, the liquidators had to clean 100 tons of radioactive debris from the roof. The initial plan was to use robots for the task. After cleaning only 10% of the debris, the robots malfunctioned as a result of the intense radiation. They had to be replaced with humans, the bio-robots. Because of the high level of radiation, the liquidators could spend no more than 1.5 minutes on the roof. This time was enough to throw a single shovelful of debris off and run away. Each liquidator was only assigned one tour on the roof, but many volunteered for 5 or more trips to the most contaminated area of the plant. There was a high cost for every liquidator. They received 120 millisieverts of radiation on average, which is equal to about 1,200 times the amount of a simple X-ray. Liquidators had to wear special protective equipment in order not to suffer a lethal dose of radiation. In such a cleanup operation, the only solution was to use equipment issued by the Army. Being one of the largest armies in the world, the Soviet Red Army had vast supplies of all kinds of equipment. In the mid-1980s, the Red Army infantrymen were equipped with the OP-1 OZK Combined Arms Protective Suit. It was an impermeable rubberized suit designed to protect against toxic substances, biological agents, and radioactive dust. The kit consisted of an OP-1M protective coat that was worn as a cloak, but could be strapped around their legs to provide better protection for the soldier's body. Their hands were protected with rubber gloves issued in 2 versions: the BL-1M summer gloves with 5 fingers, and the BZ-1M winter gloves with 3 fingers and insulated gloves inside. Finally, there was a pair of protective stockings, made from the same material as a coat with rubberized soles. As the OP-1 OZK was not airtight, it was often used in combination with a chemically treated and impregnated ZFO-58 suit made from cotton. The ZFO-58 was worn as a base layer that was covered by the OP-1 OZK suit. The color of the OP-1 suit was light green, but it could be turned inside out to the white side that was more suitable for the winter months. Due to the impermeable nature of the material it was made of, the suit was intended only to be worn for a fixed amount of time. In the summer months, the soldier wearing the OP-1 could hardly withstand more than 20 minutes in it. For protection from inhalation exposure of radioactive particles, the liquidators wore a variety of gas masks. The most common were the Army-issued PBF gas masks. There was also the PMG-2 masks used by both the Army and the Civil Defense, and GP-5M masks issued to civilians as protection in case of potential nuclear attacks. The OP-OZK was the best protection the Soviets had for the situation. However, it was far from enough. considering the high radiation levels that the Liquidators were exposed to. The suit did protect the wearer from alpha and beta particles, but provided absolutely no protection against gamma radiation. This was a huge issue for those Liquidators who worked on cleaning the most contaminated areas. Instead of OP1 OZK suits, they used custom aprons and gloves made of 2 to 4 millimeter thick lead sheets. After each shift, the protective suits became unsuitable for use by another person because of the high doses of radiation. They too were buried along with the other contaminated materials. None of the kits provided full protection for Liquidators, as many of them were exposed to extremely high levels of radiation. In the years after the incident, thousands of Liquidators died from radiation-caused diseases, and even more ended up with various disabilities. This was the price the Liquidators paid by serving and protecting their country. B-17 Ball Turret Gunner. Dangerous jobs in history. World War II. The B-17 Flying Fortress was one of the most formidable aircraft of World War II. This mighty strategic bomber largely contributed to crippling the German war industry by delivering more than a third of all bombs dropped on German soil during the war. Besides its great bombing potential, the B-17 was equipped with so many defensive machine gun emplacements that it really looked like a flying fortress. However, the fortress did not provide enough protection for the crew inside. Flying a B-17 was a very risky job since they were huge, slow, and therefore easy targets for enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses, who always marked them as primary targets. If the plane was hit, there was little chance that all of the 10-man crew could bail out. This was primarily the reason for the high casualty rates of bomber crews during the war. Out of the entire crew, the most endangered were the machine gunners housed in overexposed emplacements. One emplacement in particular carried the greatest risk: the position of the underbelly ball turret gunner. Ball turrets were originally not part of the B-17's defense system. In the beginning, the bottom of the bomber was protected by a remote-controlled version, which was quite a complex and troublesome system. Only from the 113th aircraft onwards did Boeing engineers begin to install the much better Sperry ball turret. The Sperry ball turret was a remarkably good, practical design. It was a spherical chamber made of aluminum and plexiglass attached to the fuselage at the aft section. Manned and electrically operated, the turret moved very quickly. It could revolve a full 360 degrees and pitch down to a 90-degree angle. With such features, it covered the entire area below the aircraft. It was attached to the fuselage by a shaft with a hydraulic pump that allowed it to retract into the aircraft. This was done in case of an emergency landing without using the landing gear. The B-17's ball turret was armed with two 50 caliber AN M2 Browning machine guns firing 700 to 850 rounds per minute. Each machine gun was belt-fed from two ammo boxes placed inside the fuselage. The turret may have been well designed, but was claustrophobic at only 4 feet in diameter. Inside there were two hand controls for turning and pitching, both with electrical firing buttons. There was also a seat, a computing K4 gun sight, and a set of ancillary equipment. The dimensions of the turret required a gunner of very small stature. Even then, the only way to fit inside was to curl up in the fetal position. The gunner was in such a position that he had to aim through the sight between his knees. In this highly uncomfortable position, the gunner used both his hands to control the movement of the turret and feet to adjust the sight. Spending hours in this position at very low temperatures was difficult as it was, on top of the task of swiveling around in combat and focusing on shooting enemy aircraft. It took a lot of guts to enter the turret and face the enemy in the skies. Entering the weapons system was conducted from inside the aircraft. The entry hatch was positioned opposite the machine guns. In order to open it, the gunner had to manually turn the turret until the hatch was positioned inside the aircraft. It was never manned during takeoffs and landings for safety reasons, only when the aircraft was in the air. Even then, the gunner had to be careful. Entering the turret consisted of several predefined steps, and if the gunner failed to follow these orders, it led to injuries and even fatal accidents. Outside the turret, the gunner was completely exposed to enemy fire, especially since most of the fire was coming from below. Fighter planes attacking a bomber preferred doing it from below, as this section of the bomber was the least protected. Additionally, anti-aircraft fire was also coming from below. The shell of the turret was made of aluminum and plexiglass and provided absolutely no protection against machine gun ammunition and anti-aircraft grenade shrapnel. In combat, if the turret mechanism was hit, it would be disabled, unable to turn or be retracted. This meant that the gunner would be trapped inside. In cases when the plane was forced into a belly landing, the ball turret suffered complete destruction, leaving the gunner absolutely no chance of surviving. Even during standard landings, it was risky for gunners to stay inside the turret. Of the entire crew, the ball turret gunner was the only one that didn't carry a parachute on his body or by his side. This was simply because there was no room for it. The gunner's parachute was held right beside the entry hatch inside the fuselage. To reach it, the gunner had to leave the turret. For this operation, he needed a substantial amount of time and the help of another crewman, since exiting was as complicated as the entry. Needless to say, casualties among ball turret gunners were high. The risk of their job was portrayed in a poem written by Randall Jarrell, The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to back flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose.
British Runner, World War I. The ability to communicate efficiently on the battlefield has been of vital importance for as long as there has been warfare. The inability to share information from one part of an army to another can mean the difference between an all-out victory and a crushing defeat. Over the centuries, a variety of methods have been used, ranging from basic hand signals and trained animals all the way up to the sophisticated electronic signaling systems used by modern armies. One such method that bridged the gap between the ancient world and the modern, continuing well into the 20th century, was the use of a human messenger. By the time World War I came around in 1914, communication technologies had advanced to the point where the competing armies were able to use telegraphs and field telephones to send long-range messages. However, the wires necessary for these were vulnerable to enemy attack and were often damaged. Carrier pigeons were also used to send messages back to HQ. The soldier would write a paper message in a small tube attached to the pigeon's leg and release the bird into the sky. They were the target of enemy soldiers on the ground who shot at them or used hawks to halt the message's delivery. A heliograph was another option, but it involved the use of the sun. It could only be used during the day, and it also risked giving its user's position away. If the groups trying to communicate were close enough to one another, then flag semaphore or different colored flares could be used. But it was often the case that the only possible way to get a message through was to send a human runner. The job of a trench runner was arguably one of the most dangerous of the war, as it involved leaving the relative safety of the trenches and traveling across no man's land, often in full visibility of enemy snipers and with little to no cover. Trench runners in the British Army did not have a specific uniform. Rather, they were generally kitted out in the regular uniform of a British private. From the start of the war, this would have consisted of the khaki-colored service dress uniform, first worn in 1902. The famous metal Brodie helmet was not introduced until 1916, when the realities of trench warfare had begun to sink in. Standard infantry were supposed to carry multiple rounds of ammunition, a bayonet, a knife, an entrenching tool, a water bottle, a Lee Enfield rifle, and a greatcoat or blanket. At certain times, they would also be carrying food rations and whatever personal items they chose to take with them. The British Army developed a webbing which was supposed to evenly distribute the weight of their kit. Nevertheless, the full weight of around 70 pounds would prove too cumbersome for its runners. And for this reason, special provisions were granted, allowing them to refrain from carrying certain pieces of equipment when necessary. Runners also had to wear some form of distinguishing badge, most commonly a red armband to be worn just below the left shoulder. These markers meant that should other soldiers come across the body of a dead runner, they would know to search him for a message. The men chosen as runners were usually young, between the ages of 18 and 20, and due to the high risk of death or serious injury on any mission, they most often worked in pairs. If the distance to be covered was too great, then a relay system was sometimes set up to minimize the danger faced by each individual runner and maximize the chances of messages getting through. In addition to the normal skills required of a soldier, runners had to become highly adept at map reading and reconnaissance. Delivering messages was not their only special duty. They were also expected to guide new troops to their battlefield positions. This was a task which required detailed knowledge of the surrounding terrain and was further complicated by the fact that such troop maneuvers usually took place under the cover of darkness. Alfred Mendez was a runner who served with the 1st Rifle Brigade during the latter 2 years of the war. One morning during the Battle of Passchendaele, Mendez was stationed with C Company, a short distance from the town of Pointe-Capelle, where they received a message from headquarters which read, "Should the enemy counterattack, go forward to meet him with fixed bayonets. Report of 4 companies urgently needed." The group's CO, Captain Craigmile, who knew that the mission was likely a suicide one, requested a volunteer. Mendez had received training as a signaler rather than a runner, but nonetheless felt it was his duty to step forward. He then embarked on a desperate hunt across no man's land, seeking out the remaining 3 companies. He described the terrible conditions of the battlefield and explained how the snipers got wind of me, and their individual bullets were soon seeking me out, until I came to the comforting conclusion that they were so nonplussed at seeing a lone man wandering in circles about no man's land, as must at times have been the case, that they, out of a secret admiration for my nonchalance, to dispatch their bullets safely out of my way, or they may have thought me plain crazy. Not only was Mendez successful in his mission, returning to his own company entirely unscathed, but he managed to capture 10 German soldiers along the way. He also received a military medal for his actions. Corporal Robert William Illay enlisted with the Yeoman's Rifles at the end of 1915, and early on volunteered as a runner. He spent the latter 2 years of the war fulfilling his role in various battlefields across the Western Front. In August of 1916, Illay's battalion was sent to take part in the Battle of the Somme, which he described as a black, evil-smelling waste. On one particularly dramatic mission, which took place on the 15th of September, Illay describes being instructed by his general to deliver an urgent dispatch to brigade headquarters. His direct orders stated that he was to go quickly, stop for no one, and return to the same spot, whatever I heard to the contrary. After an eventful journey, he successfully delivered the message, but when he was close to the trench where he was first given his orders, he received a warning that the position had been retaken by the enemy. Illay chose to disbelieve this advice and went on to jump confidently into the trench, where he landed right in the middle of a group of extremely surprised Germans, all but one of whom turned and fled. The remaining German soldier immediately put his hands up and surrendered. On March 21, 1918, while serving close to the French village of Achet-le-Grand, this time as a runner with the Machine Gun Corps, Illay and a fellow runner were ordered on what their CO believed to be a suicide mission. News had been received stating that the front line had been wiped out and there was a desperate need for information on the German position. The CO gave both runners a drink of whiskey and a pistol, telling them that if necessary they were to shoot 5 Germans and then themselves. The other soldiers shook the hands of each runner before they departed. As it was, the mission was relatively uneventful, most of the action being long since over by the time they arrived at the front. They were heavily shelled on the return journey, but were able to successfully deliver the intelligence they had collected. Corporal Illay was lucky to survive the war, but many of his fellow runners were not so fortunate. And doing so was often a last resort when other forms of communications had either broken down or were not practical. Runners were capable of thinking on their feet and could adapt plans as necessary, an important skill in a complex field of battle. But their use reduced the fighting strength of the units they were drawn from, both in the short term when they were on a mission and in the long term due to the high casualty rate of the job. Petardier, suicidal job, late medieval to early Renaissance. Petardiers were special units of late medieval and early Renaissance armies. These explosive specialists were not engaged in open battles, but only during sieges where their skills were the most useful. Their task was to prepare and set up explosive charges to breach obstacles that were impenetrable to infantry units. Their targets were mainly fortress walls and city gates, but were also engaged against other impediments. These types of units first appeared in France in the late 16th century during the battles against Huguenot cities. Soon they appeared in armies across the whole of Europe and remained in service until the beginning of the 18th century, when they were replaced with more reliable artillery. The name Petardier comes from petard, an explosive device they used to breach walls and gates. The weapon name was actually a funny nickname given by French soldiers, as the Middle French word for Peter means to break wind. A petard was a cylindrical or frusto-conical metal container filled with compacted gunpowder. The petard's size varied and was proportional to the resistance of the target object. Some of the preserved examples weigh as much as 100 pounds or 46 kilograms. They were made of different types of metal like bronze, copper, iron, or lead. Once loaded and sealed with wax, the petard was attached with this open end against the target surface. The open end was covered with a large wooden plank reinforced with iron plates. This addition served to spread the petard's blasting force over a larger area. Depending on the strength of the obstacle the petard was intended to destroy, there were many different ways to attach the petard. These included lag bolts, hooks, long iron forks, or even larger constructions. Besides his petard, a petardier was equipped with instruments such as a hammer, lag bolts, additional powder, fuses, flint and steel to ignite the primer, and other smaller auxiliary tools. Naturally, the petardier was not capable of carrying such a heavy load by himself. Therefore, one chief petardier was also accompanied by several assistant petardiers. They helped him carry the petard and tools, but were also armed with muskets to protect him from fortress defenders. Considering the nature of their job, petardiers wore special heavy armor. One such example, found in Switzerland, was used by a petardier in L'Escalade, the attempt of the Savoyan army to conquer the walls of the city of Geneva on December 11, 1602. This armor was much thicker than ordinary armor of infantrymen, with thickness varying from 0.2 to 0.38 inches, or 5 to 10 millimeters, and a total weight of 40 pounds or 18 kilograms. The armor was strong enough to protect the petardier from both enemy muskets and petard blasts. The helmet was of an even stronger design. It was 0.7 inches or 8 millimeters thick and 25 pounds or 11.4 kilograms. It had an inner lining and cheek protection. The petardier armor covered only the upper part of the body because they mainly received attacks from above. This design also allowed better leg mobility, which was of vital significance once the petard was ignited. Without armor on his legs, the petardier could run away quickly from the blast. It was obvious that the armor was a great burden for the petardier to carry. However, it was necessary since the petardier's duties had many dangers. Petardiers were exposed to enemy attacks. The weak spots that the petardiers targeted were often watched over by the best guards. Once the petardier appeared on sight, he became a target for the enemy guards aware of the danger he was bringing. Even if the petardier managed to reach his target and set the fuse, this was not the end of his problems. Inadequate fuses or strayed powder often caused immediate explosions. Even if everything went as planned, the petardier could still be killed by the explosion if he wasn't fast enough to reach his cover. For this reason, the job of the petardier was not a popular one. A high percentage of petardiers didn't live long enough to become veterans of their jobs. Because of the many dangers of the job, William Shakespeare coined the expression, "hoist with his own petard." First used in the play Hamlet, it signifies when a person is harmed by their own plan to harm others, like how a petard bomb maker was blown up by their own bomb.